much for the introduction, Lucy. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and lead the discussion on the top 2%, how to identify and build for your most powerful users. So your top 2% can be instrumental in shaping your product's growth and trajectory. And most businesses or product teams actually tend to ignore this group because they're so small in number. But by not ignoring, or by ignoring these users, what you also lose is the risk of losing out on high revenue generating opportunities and high return on investment. So today, I'm excited to talk about this because when I was, I'm excited to talk about this over the course of the next 20-something minutes. We'll talk about how to discover these users, pinpoint to these users, and ultimately adapt our product to their behavior. But first things first, I'd love to take a brief moment to introduce myself. So, as Lucy said, I'm Gopika, currently leading the growth organization at Tier. At Tier, I lead the activation, payments, engagement, and CRM tech teams. And prior to Tier, I've been at companies like Zalando and Wayfair. And the reason why I chose this topic is because when I was submitting a proposal to the Product Management Festival, it got me to think on what was the most pivotal change that has happened over the last year for us at Tier. And one of the main things that completely changed was our focus on specific customers, or you can say the customer strategy changed. And I don't know how many of you are experienced with the shared micromobility world, but yeah, if you go out here, I think in Zurich or in other cities, you can see electric scooters, electric mopeds, electric bikes, and you can basically unlock them and use them with your app. And this specific industry over the last 2 years has gone through so much. We've faced state regulations on how it can be used and how customers can actually ride it. Our customer behavior has changed because when these fun scooters appeared on the streets 3 or 4 years ago, people would just hop on out of curiosity. But now, since that time has passed, people are actually integrating this into their lives. So the user behavior of these customers have changed rapidly. And lastly, we are constantly dealing with seasonality and weather-related issues. And on top of that, we were hit by the economic crisis a year and a half ago. And since it's such an operations-heavy business, we had to do something to change. And we had to do something where we would swim rather than sink. And that's the reason why I wanted to bring up the discussion and take you through a few different areas on what Tier did, or what we at Tier did to adapt to our changing customer needs, and also focus on certain kind of customers more than the others in order for our business to thrive. Over the next few minutes, the way I've structured my talk is I'll go through what I mean by the top 2%, how to identify them. I'd love to get into some meaty stuff and actually show you 2 examples of how we leveraged the top 2% to expand on our growth. I also want to touch upon the risks of overinvesting in this group, because this talk is not about ignoring the remaining 98%, putting a blinds on, and purely building for this group. So I'll definitely talk about the pitfalls of doing that, which we as well have experienced. And lastly, some key considerations for when you would probably go and build out a core user strategy. So who are the top 2%? So your top 2% are probably a certain set of customers who are driving a disproportionate share of either your revenue or your engagement. And our goal here is to figure out how do we identify these groups, invest in them, and retain them. And as I said, most companies tend to ignore this group because in the end, they're basically outliers. And the point here is to see how do we bring these vast different kinds of metrics together to actually have a structured way to identify your top 2%. And the reason why this number is 2% is because that's how much we see at tier. So at tier, we have split our user group into 4 broad themes. The first theme, which makes up our majority of users, is the first-time users. So they are the users that have just been activated, they've taken a ride for the first time, and then we have the infrequent group of users who have used our product or are using our product every couple of months based on the weather. So sometimes they're dormant, sometimes they're active. It's very varied. Then we have ideal sets of users who use our product every couple of weeks. And lastly is the top 2% of our users who use our product multiple times a week, rain or sunshine. And the reason why that's important for us is because when we look at the revenue split of these users, we actually see that our VIP cohort generates about 40% of our revenue. And that is absolutely huge. In our case, they are literally the bread and butter of our company. And we might think that this top 2% of users are very static. And certain companies also, I guess, make the mistake of thinking that they only have one core persona, so someone who is either driving revenue or either driving engagement. But your business or product can actually have multiple different types of core user personas. There are a few different criterias that you can, it's very, very broad, but there are a few different criterias that they actually exhibit that either set them apart from each other or from the rest of your 98%. Number 1 is they're highly engaged. They use your product multiple times a day. They're the first ones to actually discover what your features are. They're very, very engaged with what you're building and also engaged to communicate with you on what they want. Number 2 are revenue generators. So in the case of tier, you see that such a small percentage of group is driving the maximum revenue. So they're the ones actually contributing to your financial bottom line. And lastly, influencers. These are the users that are lowering your paid acquisition costs by bringing in additional users to your product. And this is especially true, I think, in B2B. So in a previous company, when I was working on the B2B side, we actually saw that our core user group was acting as catalysts for the product. And they had the ability to draw in additional users to our product and at times also shape new habits within their peer group, making them the bread and butter of certain companies. There are different ways to actually identify who your top 2% can be. And these are not the metrics that I would just rely on completely because these are just baseline metrics. So certain companies use the customer lifetime value, the key actions or engagement that is most valuable for a certain business. Revenue per account, this is true for B2B use cases, and referral rates, the users that are actually bringing the most amount of customers to your product. So based on your business type, you need to understand what is the most important action for your business and what drives growth. And that's the baseline metrics that you use to actually identify the top 2%. And these are, again, very broad, very broad metrics. And you need to go deeper into them and apply certain segmentation and cohorting techniques to get to your ideal definition of a core user. Let me give you an example. So if at tier, we specifically chose an engagement metric, so people who are opening our app every single day to identify our core user base, we would be actually losing out on people who are actually generating revenue, because they might not come in that, the beautiful chart that you've created to identify users who are highly engaged, because these users could be less engaged, have a subscription, and might be contributing to revenue, but not so much engagement. So your definition of the top 2% should be very, very nuanced in order to figure out how can that specific user group drive growth. At Tier, initially we went very broad. So for us, we're a very operations-heavy business, and we focused on, as a core metric, we focused on revenue per rider. But as the economic crisis hit, and the path to profitability was even more essential, we had to basically narrow down our definition of who our most core group of users are, and who are the users contributing positively in the contribution margins. So our goal went from focusing on revenue per rider, like the users with the highest revenue per rider, to users who are the most profitable. And your business model dictates who your most valuable users are. It might be different for e-commerce, social media, music, micromobility. I also heard that Twitter at some point was looking at their top 2% based on the amount of tweets they generated. And the top 2% of the Twitter users actually generated about 60% of the tweets. So for them, that was the metric that they went with. So for you, you need to figure out what are the most core actions that is important for your business. You need to ask yourself, who are our top 2% of users? And secondly, what actions are they taking that can actually contribute positively to the growth of our business? And by doing that, you can get 3 core benefits from this group. Number 1, they're an enduring source of cash flow. So it's always very expensive to acquire more users, and it's cheaper to have a fixed revenue locked in for the next X period. So by focusing on this group, you tend to have a consistent revenue across the time period. So they're an enduring source of cash flow. Number 2, they can actually drive innovation and growth, because they are very vocal about what they want. They're engaging with your features more. And by considering their opinions, considering their feedback, you can actually accelerate the product development process. And lastly, they can also serve as a group where you can validate your initial features or ideas with, because the time between product discovery and validation tends to be really high. But by leveraging this group, you can actually see how you can expand your product on after you've validated with this certain group. There are certain risks with doing this, but I'll come to that at the end of the talk. So we've talked about, what do I mean by the top 2%? How can we identify them? But I would now like to get to the meaty part and actually talk about some real life examples on how we at Tier have adapted our product to the top 2%. The first case study that I'd like to briefly illustrate and take you through is how we leverage insights from the top 2% to improve our pricing strategy. So at Tier, we employ a dynamic pricing model. It's not very uncommon. It's actually a pretty common way that e-commerce, mobility, airlines adapt their pricing based on certain dimensions. And we do the same at Tier. So based on demand, supply, weather, etc., we constantly change our pricing. And at the height of crisis, we had to think of ways to actually increase our revenue. And the first thing that we thought of was, why don't we just increase prices? Of course, we didn't do that just blatantly, but in certain cities, based on certain parameters, we actually increased the pricing of our services. And our goal was to see, how does this price increase affect the usage in our customer group? And something that we saw at the end of this experiment was that while in the remaining, or amongst the remaining customers, the usage actually went slightly down, within the VIP cohort, it stayed the same. And in some cities, we actually saw a much higher retention rate, which was very counterintuitive and quite surprising back then. And the reason now, when I look back and think about these findings, it doesn't seem as surprising, is because these users know the full benefit of what your product is offering to them. They have successfully integrated this product in their lives around shaped new habits around your product. And so the price sensitivity is not as high as, say, your users who are trying your product for the first or second time. And so we've consistently rolled out this experiment to certain customer groups in certain cities, and this was a very low-hanging fruit to actually meet certain revenue targets that we had set for ourselves. So this is the one way where, by leveraging the top 2% in a very, low dev, low tech effort, we actually met or increased our revenue targets. So that's the first example of how we leveraged this group at Tier. The second example that we also experimented with or built is we leveraged the top 2% to reduce our operational costs. So I need to give you a bit of background here. So, with Tier, people take a ride, they want to park closer to their home. But actually, the parking closer to their home might not be so much high in demand. But if they were to park, say, 10 meters down the street next to a tram station, the demand is really, really high. And when scooters are not parked in high demand areas, we deploy human capital to pick up the scooters and drop it in a high demand area. And that's kind of, quite expensive for us. So what we basically did here was we established a mutually beneficial partnership between us and the top 2%, where we basically nudged them and said, hey, if you were to park your scooter, not in location A, but B, which is, say, 10 meters away from you, you get a massive discount on your next ride. And this proved to be immensely successful for that cohort because they were the users extremely engaged with our portal. And since they used our product so much, they actually were looking for ways to save costs. But our goal was not just to roll out this program for this elite group of users, but actually use them as a validation tool to roll it out to the next best engaged users. But yeah, eventually this program not only reduced ride costs for the user, which actually contributes to their higher retention rate and high engagement because they're getting a significant benefit of parking the scooters in a certain way, but also reduced operations costs for our business because the user or Tier as a company doesn't have to, deploy humans to pick up the scooter from one place to another. So what we did here was we basically didn't solely build for the top 2%. Initially we did, but our goal was always to see how can we push more new users as a new cohorts of users or the next most engaged group of users to the engagement of the top 2%. So this program served lower operational costs, higher customer retention amongst our VIP users, and also it helped us validate the product sooner so we could roll it out to the next best set of users. So these are all the good things, of course, that can come with, building for your core users or for your power users. But at times, we can also get really biased in product development. When we see certain areas that are working, we want to actually invest further and further into it. We get biased, we don't see the other users, and these are the only users that we're catering. And that is truly a pitfall and can lead to quite a few risks. And here are the top 4 risks by experience that I've noticed when we over-cater to solely these users without thinking of the majority. So the first one is there is a risk that you're building a two-tiered experience. And what I mean by that is your app experience is extremely clunky because you have certain features that are solely visible or solely for, that elite group of users while ignoring the rest. This can make the app experience very complex to navigate. And it can also result in high technical costs because you're maintaining a lot of different services. And second, as a result of this, you're alienating the majority of the users. We actually faced this at Tier, where at some point we were so excited by this group that we were building a big loyalty program, looking at usage metrics, and we had rolled this program out to everyone. And our users who had, say, taken 2 or 3 rides didn't really get any benefits from this program because they didn't have a need to take a scooter, so the entire program was built on usage, so it didn't appeal to them. And what it makes them feel is, while they had maybe other challenges related to safety, pricing, etc., by building programs only to a specific group, they can also feel that we as a company are ignoring their unmet needs. And this is really important because while your 98% of your users are also forming new habits and are becoming stickier to your product, and they could be your future power user. So by solely focusing on this cohort of users, you have the risk of your future power users churning. So the focus here should be, instead of over-investing in your top 2%, you can actually think of how can you leverage them to achieve your overall product goals. And while you're building out your core user strategy, you can actually think of 4 different ways how you can leverage this group of users. Number 1, the core users, so the top 2%, can be leveraged as an acquisition tool, because paid acquisition and getting in users from paid acquisition can sometimes be very, very expensive. But if you see that certain users are contributing to bringing in additional users or shaping habits of their peers who eventually turn into customers of your products, you can actually incentivize them to get more users in. So you can leverage this group to speed up your acquisition process. Number 2, you can actually adapt your monetization and pricing for the better, to improve on your growth goals. And maybe it's better if I illustrate this with an example. So at Tier, as I said, we noticed this set of users who are engaging constantly with our features, constantly taking more rides. But our pricing model was very linear. We just, charged people based on the amount of rides. But now we adapted our monetization model where if someone wants to buy a pass, it's a collective mix of both features and usage. So we adapted our monetization and subscription, the subscription components based on taking into account that they care about a mix of features and usage. So that's how we tailored our model. Number 3 is you can use them as a validation tool. We've already spoken about it. You don't have to run a million experiments. You can actually use this group who are already highly engaged to get an initial validation of your product. But I want to point out that this only works if, the next set of users, the next most set of engaged users have similar qualities to your power user. Because you can say that you're building a certain feature solely for this group, and you want to expand it at a later stage, but this would fail if the remainder of your user base or certain other cohorts of your user base exhibit completely different properties than your top 2%. So that's something that you probably should be mindful about. And lastly, you can position your product to new audiences. In certain situations or scenarios, your top 2% actually knows or have realized new use cases than what you're building for or intending to build on. So you can use these examples to actually position themselves in newer segments. And the last example I'll give at this talk is around this. So when we built this program for our VIP users, we didn't realize that this was actually also increasing the affordability of our product. So we're basically telling people park instead of at A, park at B, and they get a discount. But based on reviews and understanding, understanding the perspective of our VIP users, we actually found out that a lot of our VIP users are students. So this use case could be then taken to the group of students who might also want to work with us or ride with us and position ourselves as an affordable product by taking certain actions that are good for our business. So that's the fourth and the last way, amongst, of course, many other, that you can leverage your top 2%. So with that, I hope that I think at the end, just want to conclude by saying that investing in power users or investing in your top 2% is great, but you also need to consider how it fits into your overall growth strategy. So it's not a one-fit solution to all, as amongst other things. So thank you so much for joining the discussion. And I think if you have time for questions, that would be great.
Thank you so much. We do have time for a couple of questions, if we have any in the audience. Do we have any hands? If not, I can get us started. Obviously, tier is present in lots of different markets. Do you find there's much nuance needed to think about that top 2% in different places, or is it fairly similar across your markets?
I think it's quite different because, as I had mentioned at the start of the talk, our product is severely influenced by state regulations, by weather-related conditions. So our top 2% in different markets based on these dimensions really vary. And so that's the reason why this gets even more complicated, because we can't look at top 2% globally because we're situated everywhere from Europe to the Middle East, but look at it at a very detailed level. So the metrics to identify the top 2% are very broad and needs several other dimensions to get to that core user group.